October 16, 1962. The President of the United States wakes up to the worst news imaginable. The Soviet Union is building nuclear missile sites in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. Missiles that could hit Washington, D.C. in 5 minutes. For the next 13 days the world held its breath. One wrong move, one miscalculation, one hot-headed general, one itchy trigger finger, and a billion people would die. This is the story of the most dangerous 13 days in human history. The days we almost ended everything. Let's set the stage. It's 1962. The Cold War is at its peak. The United States and Soviet Union have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over. Both sides are paranoid. Both sides are convinced the other will strike first. And then Cuba becomes communist. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed Cuban government. Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores, was now aligned with the Soviet Union. The CIA tried to overthrow Castro with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. It failed spectacularly and only pushed Cuba closer to the Soviets. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity. The US had nuclear missiles in Turkey, right on the Soviet border. So why shouldn't the USSR put missiles in Cuba, right on America's border? In secret, throughout the summer of 1962, the Soviets began shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba. Not just any missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles capable of hitting Washington, D.C., New York, and most major American cities in minutes. No warning. No time to respond. And for months the Americans had no idea. Then, on October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and took photographs. When CIA analysts developed the film, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Launch pads, missiles, support equipment. The Soviets were building nuclear missile sites in Cuba. On the morning of October 16, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy walked into President John F. Kennedy's bedroom and woke him with the news. "Mr. President, we have a problem." Kennedy immediately assembled a secret group of advisors called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. For the next 13 days they would meet in secret, debating how to respond. The options were terrifying. Option 1, do nothing. Let the missiles stay. But that would mean Soviet nuclear weapons permanently 90 miles from American soil. Politically impossible. Strategically disastrous. Option 2, diplomacy. Negotiate with Khrushchev. But what if he stalls while finishing the missile sites? What if he refuses? Option 3, airstrikes. Bomb the missile sites before they're operational. But what if some missiles survive and Cuba launches them? What if Soviet soldiers are killed and Moscow retaliates? Option 4, invasion. Send in the military, overthrow Castro, destroy the missiles. But the Soviets have 40,000 troops in Cuba. It would be war. Option 5, a naval blockade. Surround Cuba, prevent more Soviet ships from delivering missiles, force Khrushchev to negotiate. It's an act of war, but maybe, it gives both sides room to back down. Kennedy's military advisors wanted to strike immediately. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff, pounded the table. We should just go in and knock them out. He called diplomacy, appeasement. But Kennedy remembered the Bay of Pigs disaster. He didn't trust the military's promises that an air strike would work perfectly. And he knew one thing his generals didn't seem to grasp. If this escalated, 100 million Americans and Russians would die. On October 22, Kennedy went on national television. For the first time, the American public, and the world, learned about the missiles in Cuba. Kennedy announced a quarantine of Cuba. He avoided the word blockade, because a blockade is legally an act of war. But everyone knew what it meant. The US Navy would surround Cuba and stop any Soviet ships from delivering more missiles. And then Kennedy issued an ultimatum. If any nuclear missile is launched from Cuba, the United States will launch a full retaliatory strike on the Soviet Union. It was the ultimate game of chicken with nuclear weapons. The quarantine went into effect on October 24 at 10 a.m. By then, Soviet ships were already on their way to Cuba. Would they stop? Would they try to run the blockade? If Soviet ships crossed the line and US destroyers fired on them, World War III would begin. In the White House Situation Room, Kennedy and his advisors watched the clock. US Navy ships were positioned 500 miles from Cuba. Soviet ships were getting closer. At 10:25 a.m., a report came in. The Soviet ships had stopped. They were dead in the water just outside the quarantine line. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." But the relief was temporary. The missiles already in Cuba were still there, and they were getting closer to being operational. US intelligence estimated they'd be ready to launch within days. And then things got worse. On October 26, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a rambling, emotional letter. It was almost desperate. Khrushchev wrote about the horrors of war, about not wanting to destroy the world. He offered a deal. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba if the US promised never to invade Cuba. Kennedy's advisors debated. It seemed reasonable. But before they could respond, a second letter arrived from Khrushchev on October 27. This one was different, harsher, more formal. It demanded that the US also remove its missiles from Turkey. What happened? US intelligence later learned that Khrushchev's hardline generals had forced him to toughen his position. The Kremlin was divided just like the White House. And then came the worst day of the crisis, October 27, 1962. Black Saturday. That morning, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. It was the first casualty of the crisis. Kennedy's generals demanded retaliation. The plan was clear. If a U-2 was shot down, the US would destroy the missile sites. That was the protocol. But Kennedy hesitated. He knew that bombing the sites would kill Soviet soldiers. And once Soviet soldiers were dead, Khrushchev would have to respond. It would spiral out of control. And then, at the same time, a second crisis erupted. A US Navy destroyer was dropping depth charges on a Soviet submarine near the quarantine line. The submarine, B-59, was armed with a nuclear torpedo. The submarine crew couldn't communicate with Moscow. They'd been underwater for days. They were overheating, running out of air, under attack. The captain and political officer wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo. But there was a third officer on board, Vasily Arkhipov. Soviet protocol required all three officers to agree before launching a nuclear weapon. Arkhipov refused. He convinced them to surface and await orders. If Arkhipov had agreed, that nuclear torpedo would have vaporized the US destroyer, and the United States would have responded with nuclear weapons, and World War III would have begun. The world came that close. October 27, 1962. Black Saturday. A U-2 shot down. A Soviet submarine nearly launching a nuclear torpedo. Kennedy's generals demanding retaliation. The world was hours away from nuclear war. Kennedy made a decision. He would ignore Khrushchev's second, harsher letter and respond only to the first one. He would accept the deal. The Soviets remove missiles from Cuba, the US promises not to invade Cuba. But privately, through back channels, Kennedy's brother Robert Kennedy met with the Soviet ambassador and made an additional offer. The US would also remove its missiles from Turkey. Not immediately and not publicly, it had to look like a separate decision months later, but the missiles would come out. It was a compromise. Both sides could claim victory. Both sides could back down without losing face. On the morning of October 28, Khrushchev announced on Soviet radio that the USSR would dismantle the missile sites in Cuba. The crisis was over. US Navy ships stayed on station and watched as Soviet ships loaded the missiles and sailed back to the USSR. By November, the sites were dismantled. The weapons were gone. Major Rudolph Anderson was the only direct casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the world had come so close to losing 1 billion people that both leaders were shaken. Kennedy said afterward, "The idea that we could win a nuclear war is a dangerous illusion." Khrushchev said, "When you have weapons that can destroy all of civilization, you have to be cautious." Within a year, the US and USSR established a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, the famous Red Phone. So the two leaders could talk directly in a crisis instead of waiting for slow diplomatic cables. They also began negotiating arms control treaties. The world had looked into the abyss and both superpowers stepped back. So how close did we actually come? For decades, we didn't know the full story. But after the Cold War ended, documents were declassified and participants from both sides compared notes. What we learned was terrifying. First, the CIA estimated that Cuba had maybe 10,000 Soviet troops. The real number? 42,000. And they had tactical nuclear weapons on the island that could be used without Moscow's permission. If the US had invaded, Soviet commanders in Cuba were authorized to use nuclear weapons to defend the island. An American invasion would have triggered a nuclear exchange. Second, the submarine incident. Vasily Arkhipov's refusal to launch that nuclear torpedo was literally the only thing that prevented escalation. He wasn't celebrated as a hero at the time. In fact, he was criticized for surfacing instead of fighting. but historians now call him the man who saved the world. Third, on October 26, at the height of the crisis, a U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile was accidentally launched from California as part of a routine test. No one had thought to cancel the test. The Soviets detected the launch and for a few terrifying minutes thought the Americans had started World War III. Fortunately, they realized it was heading over the Pacific for a test range, not toward the USSR. But it was another moment where everything could have gone wrong. Fourth, during Black Saturday, while Kennedy was deciding whether to bomb Cuba, a U.S. Air Force officer in Okinawa almost launched nuclear-armed missiles against China due to a false alarm. The order was stopped literally at the last second. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't one moment where we almost destroyed the world. It was a dozen moments, any one of which could have ended everything. We didn't survive because of brilliant leadership, though Kennedy and Khrushchev deserve credit for restraint. We survived because of luck. Because Vasily Arkhipov said no. Because a test missile happened to fly over the Pacific instead of toward Moscow. Because a last-second order stopped the launch in Okinawa. 13 days. Multiple near launches. Billions of lives hanging by a thread. October 1962 was the most dangerous time in human history. Not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. Since then we've had other close calls. But never again has the world been that close to the brink for that long. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved something terrifying. In a nuclear age, survival isn't guaranteed. It's fragile. It depends on the decisions of a handful of people and sometimes just on luck. Kennedy and Khrushchev both died believing they'd save the world. They were right. But they also knew how close they'd come to destroying it. The most dangerous 13 days in history ended without a shot fired. And we're still here because, for 13 days in October 1962, the right people made the right choices at the right time. Barely. If you found this story as terrifying as I did, let me know in the comments. And remember, history isn't just about what happened. Sometimes it's about what almost happened, and how close we came to never being here at all. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.